Ronald Reagan, a life on center stage. Actor, governor, 40th President of the United States. This is the story of the private side of this very public man. What motivated him, how he operated, a candid story told by his family.
He was an intensely private man who thrived in public.
He was very comfortable by himself. I mean, obviously he needed my mother and all that, but he didn't need a lot of people in his life.
Moments that are etched in their minds.
When he couldn't speak my name, when he would see me, his arms would open up. And I became the face that hugged him hello and hugged him goodbye and said, I love you.
A behind-the-scenes story told by those who worked with him when he stepped away from the public glare.
I never felt totally that I knew every heartbeat, but I knew him well enough, I knew his humor well enough, I knew his principles well enough.
Была личность. Я думаю, это великий президент. Это великий президент.
He was an authentic person and a great person. If someone else had been in his place, I don't know if what happened would have happened.
Получилось бы то, что получилось, или нет?
A personal story told by the woman who was at his side in victory and defeat for more than 50 years.
He was the most wonderful man that ever drew breath. Completely without guile. Great sense of humor. Just great.
This is what he loved: open spaces with room to move, rugged hills, quiet trails where he could ride, time with Nancy, and always something to build or do or fix.
We would get up in the morning, have breakfast, go riding, come back and have lunch, and then he was off to work with trees or whatever, and and he'd come back to the ranch house about 5:30, so dirty and loving it. Loving it.
To understand Ronald Reagan, the ranch near Santa Barbara is a good place to start. It offers clues to him and to his private world. The place is modest, disarmingly simple. There's little to suggest that the 40th President of the United States once owned it. Those who spent time with him say he seldom talked shop or politics. It was mostly guide talk and jokes and constant projects, recalls Dennis LeBlanc, who worked here alongside Reagan for more than 20 years.
The president's idea was to have a fence that flowed rather than being straight. He wanted it to follow the contour of the land.
Okay, Dennis, mark them.
They were 45-foot long poles, and we actually had to drag each pole with the tractor to get it in place, and then we cut them to length with chainsaws and notched them with chainsaws and hatchets.
So what was he doing through all of this?
Dug the holes, he drove the tractor, he nailed, he cut.
The ranch shows how Reagan could compartmentalize his life. In all his years here, no official guests, no visiting heads of state, not even his vice president ever spent the night. Rarely did the Reagan's guests even make it into this den. The children slept in a separate guest house. A central trait emerges. His children describe it as a certain elusiveness.
He didn't need to know that a lot of people really understood him and got him and all of that kind of stuff, because he was comfortable within himself. And I think that people who are like that do tend to be a bit elusive.
The most amiable man you'd ever want to meet. You know, friendly to everybody, everybody likes him. But that last 10% was tough. He'd hold it back and he'd hold it back, and I don't think even his family ever really got down to the bottom of that.
What was missing is my dad never told me he loved me. And I'd seen other kids have their parents say, I love you to them, but I'd never heard my dad say he loved me. And I think I held that against him for a long, long time. As much as I wanted to be like him, I wanted him to say, Mike, I love you.
His love for Nancy was clear, but there were certain places even she couldn't go.
He was a very private man. He loved people, but there was a privacy about him too, which is very appealing.
Introspective? Analytical?
No, you could never get Ronnie to sit down and have a discussion about himself, ever.
Reagan relied on instinct more than analysis. And as he recalled in later years, the instincts came not from the West, but from the Midwest of his youth.
We moved to Dixon, Illinois when I was 9. All of us have a place to go back to. Dixon is that place for me.
Humble origins and an indelible childhood. Nellie, his mother, was a woman of deep faith. Jack, his father, moved from job to job. He was an alcoholic.
My father used to tell the story about having to drag him in from the snow into the house, passed out drunk. And he told it as if it only happened one time. I find it hard to believe it only happened one time. I think that's just how his memory processed it.
And he never told that story, and I heard him tell it 5 or 6 times without saying, and my mother said, Ronnie, it's a disease.
Being the child of an alcoholic father was huge in his life, more than he was consciously aware of, because I think it just is. For any child of an alcoholic, I think that alcoholic parent always sort of stays twisted in someone's shadow.
You could play armchair psychologist and say alcoholic father and, all that sort of thing. And maybe that's it. I don't know. But it's there, and it always has been there.
He couldn't really rely on his father to provide for them or to keep a job or anything like that. And so I think he became very determined to succeed in whatever he did.
Success that was public from the very beginning. His first job was as a lifeguard on the Rock River.
I worked 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day for $15 a week. One of the proudest statistics of my life is 77.
This guy had saved 77 people from drowning by the time he was 22 years old. 77 people on the earth that wouldn't be there, perhaps, if he hadn't been there. By the time he was 22 years old, he was just a kid. I think he saw himself as at least possibly a savior in a way. I don't mean that in a religious sense, certainly, but somebody who could save the day, somebody who could be the hero, who could ride in on the white horse with the white hat and do that.
He would do that in the movies, of course, but also in life.
I remember when I was a kid up in Sacramento, they used to have parties for the legislature in our backyard. We had this big pool backyard, and he was there, and he was mingling and doing his thing, but he was always keeping an eye on the pool, because he always did. There were kids. They'd bring their kids, and the kids were in the pool. And he was watching, and one little girl dove to the bottom of the pool, and he saw her go down there. He's talking to somebody, and he's watching her, and she's not coming up. And she's not coming up, and she's not coming up. Excuse me. In mid-conversation, he dives to the bottom of the pool, scoops this little girl up, puts her on the side, and there's a photograph of him standing waist deep, chest deep in the pool, hair plastered to his head, shirt plastered to his body. And my mother and the little girl's mother are there doing motherly things. The towel is around her, and they're hugging her and things. And there's the father in the background looking like he just swallowed a live goldfish.
Water was a big thing in our family. He taught me how to have respect for the ocean and to never be arrogant about it, but also to not be afraid. And there is something, I think, that you learn about life by learning how to judge the waves in the ocean, that to get out past the waves, you have to swim toward them. And if it's about to break, you swim faster to get up over the top and come down off the back of it, or you dive underneath it where the water's calm underneath.
In his career as in the ocean, Ronald Reagan seemed to know when to dive underneath and when to ride the crest of the wave through the tides of history.
I wanted to be an actor. To say that I wanted to be a movie star would have been as eccentric as saying I wanted to go to the moon. But I had an idea, to start in radio.
Becoming a radio announcer in the midst of the Great Depression was a ticket to a steady job. He loved the microphone and the audience it brought him. The next wave, motion pictures. Starting in the late 30s, Reagan made more than 30 films in 5 years.
What is the captain's pay, Jeff? $38? 40. 40 a month.
The way Reagan dealt with Errol Flynn in Santa Fe Trail has become family legend, seen as an example of his drive, understated but unmistakable.
It's a famous story. Errol was well known for not wanting anybody to be in competition with him.
The director came over to my dad and he said, you know, we're going to move you to the back of the group instead of standing right next to Errol. And my dad knew that Flynn had gone to the director and said, I don't want Reagan standing next to me.
So they put Ronnie in back of him, and okay, Ronnie, let it be.
So he said, well, I was a good sport, and so I just went to the back like the director asked me, and while we were rehearsing the scene, he said I was dragging dirt with my feet from side to side and making a little pile.
And then when they said, shoot, he just stepped up on there and he was above Errol.
He wasn't the top actor in the United States, but he was at least in the top dozen. And he was traveling with people like Betty Davis and Shirley Temple and all these. They were his friends. He knew them all. He was married to them.
Reagan met Jane Wyman on the set of Brother Rat. Soon it was Ronnie and Janie in the fan magazines. A Hollywood wedding, a daughter Maureen, and an adopted son Michael. But the marriage didn't last. Neither did the Hollywood halo, knocked off by the distractions of World War II and parts that just didn't come his way. It was a difficult time for Reagan. He became a leader in the Screen Actors Guild and in Hollywood's fight with communists in the industry's unions. But things didn't really turn around until one day in November 1949, when he met an actress named Nancy Davis.
I was very lucky. I really was. We met at a time that was just right for both of us. I mean, he was everything I ever wanted, and I guess he felt the same.
They were married in 1952, and within 2 years, Reagan had moved to the powerful new medium of television. As host of GE Theater, Reagan took an early turn as pitchman for the American Dream.
This is a transistor radio, too. Weighs only a few ounces. You can slip it right into your pocket.
And so he popped through the television camera into people's homes. That's very good. A lot of the stars didn't make that transition.
Electricity brings it to us. It's another way we live better electrically.
It required new people with new talents, and he had it.
You haven't mentioned the best part of the meal.
What do you mean?
The coffee.
Oh, that's right. You say that our new percolator makes the best coffee in California.
And suburbs.
Well, that's what I mean. My electric appliances do everything.
As part of his deal, Reagan spoke at GE plants and civic organizations all over the country.
When he was a movie actor, he never saw the audience. When he went to work for General Electric, he toured this country, plants, working people, and he always spoke for 10 or 15 minutes and then had a half an hour to 45 minutes of Q&A.
The early speeches contained what would become familiar themes about government, democracy, and taxes. His family heard the speeches too. Michael remembers asking for a raise in his allowance.
My dad says to me, he says, you know, Michael, I'll give you a bigger allowance when the government gives me more money. I'm 8 years old. I said, what government? What are you talking about? And he said, I pay about 93 cents out of every dollar to the government. I'm thinking, 93 cents? That's 7 cents out of every dollar you get to keep. And so he starts talking to me about the fact that the taxes are too high, that if they weren't as high, I might be able to get a bigger allowance. And when a president's elected that finally gives him some money back, come talk to me again about that allowance.
Reagan would turn his private lectures into stump speeches. The next wave would be politics.
Ladies and gentlemen, we take pride in presenting a thoughtful address by Ronald Reagan.
I have been permitted to choose my own words and discuss my own ideas regarding the choice.
The nation got its first look at the new political Reagan during his 1964 televised speech for Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater.
I believe federal employees number 2
His daughter Patty, then 12, and already showing signs of adolescent rebellion, was there.
I remember being in this auditorium with all of these, well, it was a lot of Young Americans for Freedom, all of yaffers there, with those silly hats. I remember they all had silly hats and very short hair. And I thought, oh, this is not my group. I think my discomfort with the conservative views that I had grown up around and had heard about at the dinner table a lot was the black and white nature of it. I think that's what bothered me. Well, this is wrong and this is right. And I thought, oh, can't possibly be that simple.
Can invade a man's property without a
This
warrant.
speech catapulted Reagan into the national political arena.
Somewhere a perversion has taken place. Our natural unalienable rights are now considered to be a dispensation of government. And freedom has never been so fragile, so close to slipping from our grasp as it is at this moment.
Even the young family critic felt something happen.
And I remember at one point in it, sort of the emotional climax of the speech, feeling myself almost being brought to tears. I mean, really getting that my father had a gift to stand up and talk to people and kind of reach in and get their hearts.
The California millionaires who paid for the Goldwater speech persuaded Reagan to run for governor in 1966. They raised money for traditional campaigning and for paid television programs. It was a powerful medium where Reagan had a clear advantage.
Vote for me if you believe in yourself, if you believe in your right to determine your own destiny, to plan your own lives, to make your own decisions.
The campaign was personal at times. Incumbent Governor Pat Brown attacked Reagan as a has-been actor. Lynn Nofziger, Reagan's campaign press secretary, says the criticism resonated among some of Reagan's own backers.
Even the people who were trying to elect him were afraid that he was nothing but an actor reciting lines, and he really wasn't very smart because he doesn't sound erudite. And they were afraid he would take questions and he wouldn't know the answers and so forth. And after a couple of weeks, Reagan said, "I'm going to take questions." And he went out and he started taking questions, and he did very well.
What do you intend to do about the welfare situation when you are elected?
Well, thank you. Well, they would either be required to do that work or to take training, job training, to fit them for a job out in the private sector of the economy, but they couldn't sit idly and draw a check for doing nothing.
There was something about Reagan when he talked to, whether he talked to you and me sitting here or whether he talked to a crowd, he had a knack for looking at them, for making people think that he was talking directly to them.
That you will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California. I do.
When Reagan took office in January 1967, the upheaval of the 60s was in full fury. He saw it on the streets, and he dealt with it at home.
Well, in those years, I mean, the 60s and so Berkeley years and when I was in high school, it got really much more contentious. He was sending the National Guard out to Berkeley, you know, and he was making statements like, if they want a bloodbath, they'll have one. There were some rough years there.
How to kill people in the third world.
The unrest on the campuses was just one of the challenges during Reagan's first year in office. There was also the pending execution of Aaron Mitchell.
this particular person had killed 2 police officers in the course of a robbery, the governor concluded, and I had recommended, that there was no real basis for the governor to intervene. But it was difficult, nonetheless, as it always is when you literally have the power of life and death in your hands.
The case shows how Reagan would rely on faith when confronting important challenges in politics and in his personal life. On the night of the execution, Reagan met with his minister, Don Mumaw.
At the time, the pellets, in those days, the pellets were to be dropped into the solution to provide the gas. We went to our knees around his coffee table, a little living room coffee table, and I prayed for him and prayed for the situation, and then ended in amen, and then he started to pray.
What was his prayer?
Just, God, I want to follow your will. I don't want my own will, I want your will. That was the kind of faith that he was raised with. That was his mother. Applied everything to her lifestyle.
Reagan's faith, passed on from his mother, was unshakable, but he was unable to pass it along to his son.
I think one of the things that probably disturbed him more than anything else was that at the age of 12, one Sunday, while everybody was getting ready for church, he came into my room to see if I was, had my little suit on and stuff, and there I was in my blue jeans and the t-shirt, and I simply said, I'm not going. I don't believe it, and I'm not going. And that, he didn't argue. He knew he couldn't force me, and that wouldn't be appropriate anyway. But that bothered him for a long, long time. I don't think it ever stopped bothering him.
As governor, Reagan quickly developed political interests that went far beyond Sacramento and California politics.
Well, he'd sort of try out, parts of speeches on you. Dad he could talk a blue streak, and you'd sit down at the dinner table, and it could go in the direction of a sort of a thesis, or on taxes or the Soviet Union or whatever it might have been. We probably didn't have typical dinner time conversations in our house.
He would mount 2 unsuccessful presidential campaigns, becoming the leading Republican conservative. One in 1968, when he was testing the waters to see if Richard Nixon would fail. Another in 1976, 2 years after leaving the governorship. Reagan challenged President Gerald Ford for the GOP nomination. He lost the first 5 state contests, and as primary day in North Carolina approached, his campaign was broke.
The Republican governors were calling on him to get out of the campaign. 11 of the past chairmen of the Republican Party all signed a document saying, get out of the campaign.
Stubborn, confident, or merely wanting to prove a point, Reagan wouldn't quit.
And he said, I'm not going to get out of this race. We're going to stay right on. We're going to stay through Texas. We're going to stay to the end. I am not going to get out of the race. And he walked out of the room.
That's another example of his competitiveness. No, he was not going to stop. He was going to go all the way. And we got to North Carolina, and from then on, he won everything. Then 76 convention turned out to be the most exciting convention ever.
Reagan ended up winning 23 primaries and came to the convention within striking distance of Gerald Ford. The final moments were political pandemonium. Ford desperately needed Republican unity. Martin Anderson was with Reagan that night.
And what happened was, while Ford was speaking, and when he finished speaking, the place was going crazy. The Reagan delegates were yelling, "Come on down, Reagan," and the Ford delegates were yelling for Ford. And there was so much noise, he couldn't talk on the microphone. So Ford looked up at the sky and went like this with his arms, waving him down. And I was close to Reagan, and he leaned over and he said something about, "Does that mean I'm asked?" And Devers said, "Yes, you've been asked." So he got up and buttoned his coat and headed out. I fell in behind him and went down with him. And suddenly he came out on the podium, and the entire convention was standing. Tens of millions of people looking at him. And what he said, the essence was very simple. That the main issue facing the United States is whether this nation will survive, whether we'll have a nuclear war, whether we'll get blown up.
That we live in a world in which the great powers have poised and aimed at each other horrible missiles of destruction, nuclear weapons that can in a matter of minutes arrive in each other's country and destroy virtually the civilized world we live in.
Even in defeat, Reagan had stolen the show. And though his political future was unclear, he turned to radio to maintain a public profile.
The campaign trail is no place for the cynic. I am more than ever convinced of the greatness of our people and their capacity to determine their own destiny.
My assumption was he was not going to run for president again, that he would go sit up at the ranch and be a kind of a gray eminence. And after about a year, it all of a sudden occurred to me that this guy's going to run for president again. He wouldn't tell you that. He never would tell you those things, but you could get a feel.
Reagan was giving maybe 8 to 10 speeches a month. He was editing a newspaper column twice a week, I believe. And every single day, he was writing a commentary for radio, handwritten essays. This is a tremendous workload. And I guess when you back up and you look at the documents, you have to come to the conclusion that somebody was writing this stuff, and he was alone.
Thousands of Reagan's handwritten speeches and papers remain in the family's control. Some were made available for this program. They show the scope of Reagan's interests, from the Soviet Union to the Panama Canal to race relations in Africa.
I grew up seeing him with his little note cards, writing. And he would always be at his desk. His desk was in a corner of their bedroom, in a corner of windows, and he'd always be sitting there writing on yellow pads.
And he'd sit there with them and a pen, writing and editing and stuff, and just sort of mouthing the words, just sotto voce, you know, going through the speech, just at almost a whisper sort of thing, so as not to disturb anybody else. And, you know, but he'd get the rhythm of it down and the cadence and that sort of thing.
Nancy Reagan remembers once having to safeguard the speeches.
There was a fire, you know, at one point, and they had told us that we might have to evacuate. And so I packed all of his notes to all of his speeches. I packed family pictures. I didn't pack, you know, clothes or anything like that. It was his speeches, really, that was the main thing.
I am here to announce my intention to seek the Republican nomination for President of the United States.
When Reagan decided to run again in 1980 and challenge the incumbent Democrat Jimmy Carter, the country was demoralized and in crisis. The talk was of national malaise. Americans were coping with gas lines, rampant inflation, and their countrymen held hostage in Iran. Reagan's optimism was a stark counterpoint.
A troubled and afflicted mankind looks to us, pleading for us to keep our rendezvous with destiny, that we will uphold the principles of self-reliance, self-discipline, morality, and above all, responsible liberty for every individual, that we will become that shining city on a hill.
He would prove to be unstoppable, as GOP rival George Bush would learn during a New Hampshire debate. The ground rules had been set, a two-man debate, but Reagan insisted on opening it up to other candidates. His campaign had hired the sound man, so when the moderator tried to restore order,
I am paying for this microphone.
That wasn't a very pleasant moment.
Exactly. What kind of adversary was he?
Strong adversary, and had a great command of the television. I mean, he was very good at that. But you know, that was in the heat of competition.
I mean, when you experienced that there in New Hampshire, what went through your mind when you saw him sort of take charge or take over?
Well, he did take charge, and thought, this is great show business, and it was. I was, thought I was playing by the rules, doing what the paper that sponsored the debate wanted to do and we'd agreed to do. But he rose to the occasion in a way that just blew me away.
Reagan's message was simple and familiar. America could do better. Government and taxes should be cut. Communism was bad and strength mattered. He cruised to the nomination.
We're going to put an end to the notion that the American taxpayer exists to fund the federal government. The federal government exists to serve the American people.
Reagan had some rocky moments in the fall campaign. Here he tells an audience of steel industry executives that trees cause pollution.
Growing and decaying vegetation in this land are responsible for 93% of the oxides of nitrogen.
But Americans would shrug off Reagan's mistakes, in part because he framed the campaign around one central question.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
Reagan won in a landslide, beating Jimmy Carter by 8 million votes out of 80 million cast for the two candidates. Yet as Reagan prepared for his next role in America's story, the very morning of his inaugural, he was still completely in character.
Nancy was up and bustling about, and we chatted for a little bit, and I finally said, "Where's the governor?" And she said, "Oh, I think he's in the bedroom. Why don't you just go knock on the door?" So I knocked on the door, and there was nothing. And I knocked again and opened it a crack, and it was black in the bedroom. And I opened it a little bit more, and there was this big mound of bed covers, and I said, "Governor?" And there was a grunt. And I said, "Governor, in an hour and a half, you're going to be sworn in as the 40th President of the United States." And he sat up and looked at me, and he said, "Do I have to?"
Reagan's inaugural address was no joking matter. It reflected his philosophy and his authorship entirely.
That together, with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans. God bless you and thank you.
Later that day, after the ceremony and celebration, Reagan went to the Oval Office.
I remember the very first moment that he sat behind the desk in the Oval Office. We'd come off the inaugural stand, and Nancy had gone off over to the residence, and he sat down behind that desk that had been Kennedy's and so forth, and looked at me and said, "Do you have goosebumps?" That's a pretty remarkable admission for a man who's the 40th President of the United States, that he had goosebumps just sitting there.
That night, the new president and his family celebrated.
And he's looking in the mirror at his white tie and tails. And I kind of looked past Nancy to look in the mirror and back to him to see what look is on his face. And Dad's kind of straightening his tie and kind of cocks his head to the left. He gets that little twinkle he gets in his eye at times, and straightens the tie again and gets a smile on his face, and he turns straight around to the three of us, and he jumps straight up in the air and he clicks his heels together. He says, "I'm the President of the United States of America." And we all just went, "Yes, you are."
A long and improbable journey. A president born at the opposite end of the century, who shared little with the nation's ruling class and came from an altogether different place.
Reagan came to office at 70 years of age. Normally, you would say this is a handicap. This man is quite elderly at 70 to become president. Upon reflection, it was an advantage, because Reagan had his mind made up on a lot of things. He had had a life experience of all kinds of challenges and risks and achievements. He didn't care what the New York Times editorial said yesterday morning.
The Reagan presidency was launched. On the 69th day, it nearly came to an end. About 2 miles from the White House, up Connecticut Avenue, the president had just finished a speech to the Construction Trades Council. He was leaving the Hilton Hotel by a side entrance. What happened next would become a hallmark of his legacy, one of those moments frozen in time.
Oh, I think you can't forget the fact that Hinckley shot over my right shoulder. You know, I had never heard a .22 pistol, but I could smell it. I could smell the sulfur.
I was at a luncheon that day, and for some strange reason, it's never happened to me before or since, and I hope never will, and I suddenly had this overwhelming desire to get out and go home.
And there were 10 or 15 seconds there where it was just absolute chaos and terror.
Secret Service agent Jerry Parr ordered the motorcade to abort its return to the White House and head straight for George Washington Hospital.
I will never forget Reagan, when we arrived at George Washington Hospital, having not been able to talk to the car, the limo that he was in to find out if he'd been hit, the door opens and he gets out and cinches his pants up, you know, like this, like he's coming out of an old cowboy movie, and then buttons his and walks in like this to the hospital. And I'm walking behind him thinking, and then he hit the door frame. And the minute he hit the door, he went down. But, you know, you talk about all the movies. To him, that door was the curtain. And once he got past the curtain, he was no longer on.
And then George Opfer, who was head of my Secret Service detail, he said, "The president's all right. He hasn't been hit." And I said, I'm going to the hospital, George. And even now. So he kept repeating, "But he hasn't been hit." And I said, "I don't care. I'm going to the hospital, and you either get me a car or I'll walk."
And what happened inside?
He collapsed, and the Secret Service and the orderlies picked him up and were running with him. He was flat out as they were throwing clothes off of him. So by the time we got to the emergency room, there was the President of the United States, stark naked, above everybody else. And they threw him on a table in one of the emergency rooms as they were hauling everybody else out of the emergency rooms.
The wound itself was a very peculiar wound. What had happened was that the bullet that struck him had actually struck the car first and traveled along the side of the car, so that when it entered his body, it was like a jagged dime. It was more like, it looked like a small skill saw that had flown off its axle. And so that's why they didn't realize he was shot. It had gone through more like, and I saw the clothes later on, it was more like a knife wound, and likewise a knife wound into his side. So when the Secret Service agent put his hands to see if there was a bullet wound, he didn't find anything because the wound had closed up, and the cut in the side of his clothes didn't reveal itself like a bullet wound would have.
30 minutes after Ronald Reagan entered the emergency room, he was fighting for his life. His wife arrived, fearing the worst.
I'm running into the hospital, and Mike Deaver was waiting outside, and he said the president was hit. And they put me in a little room, and all I wanted was to see Ronnie. And they kept saying, "Well, he's all right, but you can't see him just yet. But if he's all right, why can't I see him?" Yeah. And then when I finally saw him, and he had that thing over his face, and he was absolutely white. I'd never seen anything like that. And he pushed it up and said, "Honey, I forgot to duck." I pulled it back down and I said, "I love you." And
I remember thinking my father could die. My father could die, and really understanding that he could die and I might never know him as well as I'd wanted to know him.
Here we are, we've been in office for 6 weeks and the president gets shot. You know, what are we gonna do? We found the vice president was in Texas and it was gonna take him 2.5 to 3 hours to get back.
I just had the feeling, well, you know, a friend is hurt and hurting. And it wasn't anything about, you know, legacy or the burden, the mounting burden of the presidency might be on my shoulders. That's not the way I felt when I first heard that. I mean, it was, I wonder how he's doing. Great guy, I hope he's okay.
After surgery, Lynn Nofziger provided the first official report.
The president is out of surgery and is in good condition.
But his condition would soon take a frightening turn for the worse when he contracted a bacterial infection. Only those closest to him knew how bad it really was.
And the country was very fortunate. We were extremely fortunate. Not just that he wasn't killed when he was shot, but that he didn't die after getting a staph infection.
The country didn't know just how serious
The country
it was
did
at
not
the
know
time.
that. The country did not know how serious it was at the time, particularly the staph infection. They really didn't know how serious that was.
Why was that kept from the public?
We saw it. I suppose it was kept from the public because it was so serious. I mean, I don't know what's to be gained by saying the president has just acquired a serious staph infection and may die. I mean, we're not going to do that. But that would then put the country on tenterhooks for maybe 2 or 3 days. What's going to happen? How's he doing? What's his temperature this hour?
As the president's children and minister arrived, they were shocked at what they saw.
You know, I remember how pale he looked, and I remember, you know, he had that sort of ethereal. People who have nearly died have a look about them. It's sort of like there's something sort of ethereal about how they look, you know, and maybe it's that they're so pale and the blood's been, you know, the blood's drained out of them and all of that, out of their faces. My mother had told me about one of his notes that he was writing when he was intubated, so he couldn't talk in the hospital. There was this note that was scrawled that said, "I'm alive, aren't I?" And she told me that when she asked him about it later, he said it was because he sort of woke up and he was in intensive care, and there were figures in white around him, and he wasn't sure if he died or not.
I asked him, was he ready to meet God? And he said no. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I've got so much more I want to do for the people of the United States and of the world. And I said, oh, no, that's not what I meant. I meant if the bullet would have taken you and you would have died, were you ready to meet God? He thought for a moment, and then he said, yes. And I pursued it further. I said, how do you know that you're ready to meet God? And in his own way, he kind of moved his head and thought. And then he said, I'm ready to meet God because I have a Savior.
I remember him saying that his ability to heal depended on his ability to forgive John Hinckley, because clearly he was a misguided young man, is what he said.
How did you react to that?
Well, I had a hard time. I had a hard time with that.
I can't honestly say that I've reached that level of forgiveness. I could say I'm working on it. I could say intellectually, you know, I understand. My father got it, you know. I mean, that was really something that he was speaking from his heart.
While he was recovering, Reagan wrote a letter to Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. The president called for dialogue to find lasting peace saying the U.S. had no territorial ambitions.
4 or 5 days later, maybe a week later, it came back, and it had been totally rewritten by the Kremlinologists. It said, well, you know, maybe they're right. And I said, you know, Mr. President, they didn't get elected to anything. In fact, you know, they've been kind of screwing this thing up for the last 40 years. Why don't you send your letter? He turned to me and said, thank you. Thank you for reminding me about the letter. He said, I think there's a reason I've been saved, and I'm going to rely on myself a little bit more.
At age 70, Reagan healed remarkably fast. He returned to the White House just 12 days after he was shot.
How do you feel? Great. What are you going to do when you get home, Mr. President? What are you going to do when you get home? Sit down.
And when we got back to the White House and he started to go out again, every time he went through that door, I thought my heart would stop until he got back. Because, you know, in something like this, the threats increase. They'll say, well, he didn't get him, but I'll get him. And I was very aware of that. It was not a great time.
Boy, you know, you have your husband gunned down on the street. You know, that's that's no fooling around.
How did she change after that?
Well, I think she became somewhat paranoid about his safety. I mean, and even more protective, of course. She'd make sure he wore that bulletproof vest if the SS boys said he should.
Really?
You know, oh God, yeah. You know, she didn't want to take any chances with him.
Nancy Reagan secretly turned to someone she felt might provide an extra measure of insurance. She called astrologer Joan Quigley.
Joan Quigley's criteria was large public events. It wasn't the entire schedule. I just work around those days. If there were 2 or 3 days that she said were bad days for public events, we wouldn't do public events on them. I'd schedule it otherwise. My attitude about that was, if this gave Nancy Reagan some comfort, you know, I would do it. I'd do it if you threw marbles in a bowl and picked out the Aggies and said, you know, whatever it took, in other words, was my attitude. And it wasn't really affecting anything else. Nobody else knew about it except me.
While Nancy Reagan never did stop worrying about her husband, he plunged right back in.
He would look back and he said, "This is God's plan, and I'm president of the United States by divine appointment." And I think he really felt that.
Less than a month after he was shot, Ronald Reagan relaunched his presidency. A joint session of Congress gave him a hero's welcome.
You wouldn't want to talk me into an encore, would you?
That was a slam dunk.
Mr. Speaker,
Here he had come back from the assassination attempt, all the drama of it. Clearly we're shameless. We're going to take advantage of it to boost this economic program and to sell it.
That night, the stage was his. His approach was a mix of persuasion, charm, humor, and a story. Always a story. Speechwriter Ken Kachigian had found this one.
Mr. President, I said, there's this letter that I'd like you to see. Well, my hope was that he would use it in the speech. And so I gave it to him, and he looked at it, and he got a smile on his face, and he said, you know, "Oh, that's nice," and he gave it back to me. And I thought, oh, I was crestfallen, because I didn't want to force him. I wanted him to adopt this idea on his own. So for once, I thought quickly, and I said, "Why don't you show it to Mrs. Reagan?" And I gave it back to him, and he looked at it again. He says, "I've got an idea." And he folded it up and he put it in his pocket.
I have a letter with me. Letter came from Peter Sweeney. He's in the 2nd grade in the Riverside School in Rockville Center. And he said, I hope you get well quick, or you might have to make a speech in your pajamas.
America fell in love with him again.
His economic package, built around a 30% cut in income taxes, got a huge boost.
These policies will make our economy stronger, and the stronger economy will balance the budget, which we're committed to do by 1984.
Reagan never sent or saw a balanced budget. During his tenure, the national debt nearly tripled. But in April 1981, the Reagan charm offensive was at its height. Dan Rostenkowski, then a powerful Democratic committee chairman, experienced it firsthand.
Well, what do you think of our tax situation? And I said, well, Mr. President, we ought to do some things in marginal rates. I mean, I think we ought to, you know, damn, that's wonderful. Danny, you know, we're on the same wavelength, Mr. Chairman. I said, well, I'm happy to hear that, Mr. President. He says, now, I want to tell you something. When I was in films, I was paying the top marginal rate 91%. And I was kind of in my soup, and I looked at him and went back to my soup and kind of laughed. And he says, what's so funny? I said, nothing, Mr. President. No, God damn it, what's so funny? I said, well, Mr. President, 91%. He said, yep. I said, whew. He said, what's so funny? I said, I didn't think you were that good an actor. Frank, he laughed like hell.
Reagan was most focused when it came to his core issues, cutting taxes first among them.
I think what bothered him about taxes was the idea of an intrusive government, quite simply, that you worked hard for your money, and what real reason did they have to come and take it all away from you?
Reagan used the bully pulpit to push the tax cut through, a victory that paved the way for other successes.
With your help and your congressman's vote, we'll make it happen. Thank you.
We were all jealous of him, and I fought Ronald Reagan in his first year and a half of office, and I got slaughtered because he was so popular that Democrats on my side of the aisle, he was getting a majority of Democratic votes.
He didn't get everything he wanted. The tax cut he signed was 25%, not 30%.
There are many, many times I remember him telling me, Jim, I'd rather get 80% of what I want than go off the cliff with my flag flying. I would characterize Ronald Reagan as a principled pragmatist.
But economic recovery was not around the corner. The unemployment rate rose to more than 10% as the recession deepened. Reagan's approval rating in the Gallup poll dropped to 35%, the lowest of his presidency. His political opponents multiplied. Food banks and protests spread. Even some of Reagan's closest aides questioned Reaganomics. But he would stay the course.
I never saw it shake his core belief in supply-side economics. And he hung with it through all those bad times, and then, of course, it finally kicked in and really worked.
Reagan's sunny optimism was a strength, but it could also feed criticism that he was insensitive or intellectually lazy.
There was a lot of people in Washington in particular thought that he wasn't the brightest bulb in the pack. He would admit, I think, that he was often not the cleverest person in the room, and I use that word deliberately. Washington is a town, I think, that values cleverness highly, and there are no shortage of clever people around.
Nancy Reagan says her husband used the criticism to his advantage.
He was conscious of being underestimated, but then he had been in Sacramento, too. You know, so that was nothing new. And actually, I think it kind of worked in his favor. So he was conscious of it, yes.
But there were issues where he did not engage, issues that didn't fit with his core principles. Example, acid rain.
Can you tell us whether you're going to endorse the envoy's report on acid rain?
It was very frustrating. That part was very frustrating. But I couldn't get him to move, to accept the view that acid rain was that destructive and came from industrial production in the Midwest. He once said, you know, look, an argument can be made that acid rain comes from trees and from plants. Well, you know, a small part of it might be caused by that, but that's nonsense. And I told him so, but he still disagreed. He said, I don't want to do this to American industry. I don't want to limit American industry in any way. And I said, Ron, this is not right. Our two countries share this common environment. You know, fish swim, and clouds of acid rain cross the borders indiscriminately. We have to stop this. And he said, I hear you, Brian. I want to help you. But on this one, he didn't.
There were other blind spots, critics said: homelessness, AIDS, the underclass, and race.
He wasn't a racist. He didn't care if you were black or white. So wasn't all of America like that? You know, and if you pointed out to him that it wasn't, that in fact there was virulent racism and systemic racism, that was very difficult for him to, you know, really kind of grab onto. I mean, he did grant that there were individuals certainly that were racists, but boy, he hated to think about the country as being a racist nation. It didn't sit right with him. He didn't think of America in those terms. It wasn't the shining city on the hill.
Even when confronted with his mistakes, Reagan believed what he believed.
The first day I went to work for Ronald Reagan in 1983, I was deputy press secretary, and he had a press conference a couple days later. And the next day, the Washington Post ran a story saying the president made 19 errors of fact or language in the course of the press conference and laid them all out. So I went into the president, I said, Mr. President, what would you like us to do about these 19 errors or factual misleadings? He looked at me, he says, well, Marlon, I didn't think they were wrong. Don't do anything about them. But thanks for letting me know.
Mostly, the president tuned out the bad press. Michael Deaver saw him do just that.
He had the 3-month schedule in front of him, and he said, you know, I don't see any time on this for the ranch. And I said, well, Mr. President, I haven't put any time in there because, you know, the last time you went out there, the media made such a big deal about you going to the ranch. And he said, Mike, I don't care. They're always going to say that. And I'm going to the ranch. And I'll tell you why. I think the more often I go to the ranch, the longer I'm going to live. And he handed me the schedule and said, put it in. That was the end of that.
Ronald Reagan firmly believed that the critics didn't matter, that he had a special connection with the American people. It was a political chemistry that Reagan's peers found remarkable.
President Mitterrand and I were having lunch in Paris at l'Élysée, and we were talking about Ronald Reagan. Mitterrand had initially been very strongly and ideologically opposed to Reagan. He said, you know, Reagan is not so much a great communicator, although he is, as someone in communion with the American people. And there's a great difference. On the one hand, and I think Mitterrand was very perceptive, because on the one hand, a great communicator indicates you're preaching to or at an audience. If you're in communion with your audience, it means that your presence has become so persuasive and your arguments so well marshaled that your audience is part of them.
This communion with his audience was never more apparent than at times of national tragedy or remembrance. When the Marine barracks in Beirut were blown up, killing 241 Americans.
25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
When the Challenger exploded.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
When he went to Normandy to commemorate the 40th anniversary of D-Day. Reagan's speech, just over 7 minutes long, grew out of a letter from a woman named Lisa Zanata, who had promised her dying father she'd visit Omaha Beach in his memory.
It is enough for us to say about Private Zanata and all the men of honor and courage who fought beside him 4 decades ago. We will always remember. We will always be proud. We will always be prepared, so we may be always free.
Reagan was able to reflect emotion and transcend it at the same time, a powerful attribute.
I asked him when he got back, how'd you do that? How could you give such an emotional speech right from the heart and not choke up? And he told me, well, what I did, he said, I wrote it down, and then I read it to myself over and over again. So the words were still there and still came from the heart, but the emotion was kind of sublimated.
But Ronald Reagan's emotions would also lead to his most difficult days as president. Reagan won re-election at the age of 73, carrying 49 states. The economy was booming. His campaign had proclaimed Morning in America.
We see America's best days ahead. We see ourselves in a springtime of hope, ready to fire up our courage and determination to reach high and achieve all the best.
I believe in order to be a good president, you have to be optimistic. To put it in a negative way, no one's going to follow somebody who says, follow me, the world is going to be worse. Ronald Reagan said, follow me, the world is going to be better.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear. I, Ronald Reagan, to the United States.
As his second term began, Reagan governed as he had in the first. Concentrate on the big issues, such as relations with the Soviet Union, and trust competent people to take care of the details.
He said, Brian, I hire good people, I put them in place, and I tell them to enact my program. I put them in, I give them carte blanche to do their thing. He said, I'm not interested in the details of how they get from point A to point B. I want them to get to point B.
But there were big changes in his staff. The first-term trio of Baker, Deaver, and Meese were gone to other jobs. Those now closest to Ronald Reagan understood his principles and his style, but not his vulnerabilities. Donald Reagan arrived insisting that he'd control everything that moved in the White House. The chief of staff who knew just what the boss needed.
Ronald Reagan liked to hear stories and draw parallels and things of that nature. So if I really wanted to get a point across to him, I would always start off with a story in order to get his attention and get him focused. And once you got him focused on that, then you could make your point.
But stories could also backfire, especially when combined with Reagan's penchant to delegate. In 1986, the president found himself sucked into the violence of the Middle East as he tried to get America's hostages out of Lebanon.
We kept feeding him stories about what was happening to the hostages. And we kept saying, you know, you've got to speak out about these Americans that are being held there. And I think the president internalized that very deeply.
So when people came along with this notion of selling arms to Iran, and by the way, Mr. President, we'll get our hostages back, he fell for that.
Kathy Osborne, Reagan's secretary, remembers her boss's reaction when there was some good news about hostage David Jacobson.
He came in the office and he was almost doing a little skip dance, and he was singing a little song from grammar school days. He was so excited that he was coming home.
The president had told Americans he'd never negotiate with terrorists, but now he was trading arms for hostages. Compounding the problem, a White House staffer was using the profits to fund Nicaragua's anti-communist rebels, the Contras, in violation of a congressional ban.
That was done by Oliver North and his crowd. Whether or not the CIA knew about it, I don't know. But I do know this, Reagan knew nothing about that. That was done at a different level, way down in government by a Marine major And you can't expect the President of the United States to know what every Marine major is doing.
The Iran-Contra scandal became Reagan's worst political crisis. Attorney General Ed Meese broke the news to the president.
He was obviously shocked and disturbed by this because what it did was it brought two very controversial policy issues and put them together kind of like a match and gasoline.
Do you still maintain you didn't make a mistake, Mr. President?
Hold it.
Did you make a mistake in sending arms to Tehran, sir?
No, and I'm not taking any more questions in just a second.
Nancy Reagan assumed a familiar, now needed role, the protector.
Well, he never believed that anybody would do anything less than honorable with him. My little antenna went up. I could sense when they were.
No one was let go. They chose to go.
What about Secretary?
What is it that you were sensing?
They were using him. They were spinning their own version of something that might have happened that didn't happen the way they told it. And I knew it didn't happen.
Mrs. Reagan was convinced that Donald Reagan had to go.
My father's reaction was, I'm not going to fire somebody to save my ass.
He said that?
In those words, I'm not going to fire somebody to save my ass.
You heard that?
No, but my mother did, and she related it to me.
The First Lady brought in outside advisors to tell her husband just how bad it was.
Somebody had to level with Ronnie and tell him he'd been very badly served, very. I mean, people were going off doing things that he knew nothing about. But he found himself in this position, and somebody had to make him face up to it. Because in his mind, he had done nothing wrong.
Reagan was out. Ken Duberstein was part of a new team charged with saving the Reagan presidency.
I looked into his eyes to see whether or not he was telling the truth, whether his eyes were averting. I wanted to see if there was a facial twitch.
Providing recommendations on how it should operate.
It was a very, very tough time. And yet we became convinced that Reagan, perhaps by benign neglect, had let others run away with the store.
Was this a case where his delegation and detachment worked to his detriment then?
Absolutely.
Eventually, Reagan accepted responsibility.
I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
Americans forgave him, but the scandal took a political toll unlike anything Ronald Reagan had ever experienced. From his first days in the White House, Ronald Reagan was an outspoken critic of the communists in the Kremlin.
The only morality they recognize is what will further their cause, meaning they reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, in order to attain that, and that is moral, not immoral. And we operate on a different set of standards.
Reagan was giving voice to suspicions he'd held for 30 years.
He was the first president in memory to call a spade a spade. These were our enemies. This was an evil empire. We didn't talk about engagement or disengagement. He just said, these people are bad, and we want them out of there.
The president backed up his rhetoric with an unprecedented military buildup.
He said that if it comes down to a choice between balancing the budget and regaining our military strength, I'm always going to come down on the side of regaining the military strength.
The policy was controversial, and millions of Americans and Europeans demonstrated against the buildup, fearing accidental war or nuclear winter. The president's own daughter was among them.
I'd been involved in the anti-nuclear movement before he was elected president. Looking back on it, I can see how clearly hurt he was. And he would still try to see, he would say, well, you know, I'm president, I have access to all this information, and, you know, I just was not going to I really wasn't going to give him the opportunity to talk to me as his daughter in the way that he wanted.
In fact, Patty's father had called for arms reductions prior to taking office. Scholar Chiron Skinner has been studying Reagan's handwritten documents from the late 70s.
SALT II is not strategic arms limitation. It's a strategic buildup with the Soviets adding a minimum of 3,000 nuclear warheads. He's saying this is not reduction.
This is Reagan's draft of a speech he gave in 1979, criticizing the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. He opposed the treaty because he felt it did not address the real problem.
What's really significant about it is that it shows that Reagan was not a warmonger, that he was not anti-arms reductions, that he wanted arms reductions, not arms control, the way it was being presented in the SALT II treaty. He wanted real reductions, and that's what he's saying here.
3 Soviet leaders died during Reagan's presidency. Then came a new, younger leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. For the first time in Reagan's presidency, U.S. and Soviet leaders met.
And then we turned to the photographers and the pictures we're taking. And that moment, it etched in my memory. I remember that even at the steps of that house, something happened. The kind of handshake, the kind of openness, and that remained with us.
It was almost immediate bonding. Even though you couldn't understand anything that he said, there was a warmth about him. There was a humor about him. You just liked him.
But Reagan was still very much the anti-communist.
I remember being in Geneva for the first summit between my father and Gorbachev, and I spent those couple of hours outside the room with my ear to the door, listening to what was going on. And it was a lot of, everything wrong in the world is your fault, Mikhail. Well, not everything in the world is our fault. Some of it's your fault, Ron.
He started to sound rather patronizing as with regards to the leader of the Soviet Union, and I felt as if he was lecturing me. He said, "Well, you, Mr. General Secretary, you should really take my suggestions." I said, "Mr. President, you are not a teacher. I am not a student."
But when they got up from that table and they went down to that little boathouse or pool house and sat in front of the fire where it was just the two of them and a translator for much longer than they were supposed to be there, the entire dynamic changed. And they emerged from that little room pals.
So that changed the situation, and we went beyond it. And a little later, at our next meeting, he said, "Mr. General Secretary, I suggest you call me Ron, and I will call you Michael."
General Secretary Gorbachev, we ask you to join us in getting the job done, as I'm sure you will.
The Geneva summit established a tone and a rapport. The joint communique declared that nuclear war could not be won and must never be fought. Nearly a year later, in Reykjavik, Iceland, the two men met again. This time they talked about slashing their nuclear arsenals.
Here we were in this house in Reykjavik, isolated place, windy place, and there was a little room where we met. In the course of the meetings, Gorbachev had set out Soviet proposals that were tremendous concessions to what we had argued for. In some cases, practically agreed with our positions.
Ronnie had called me and said, "Everything's going fine. I'll be home for dinner."
Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, with proposals to eliminate thousands of missiles on the table, deadlocked over SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, Reagan's dream of a space-based anti-missile system.
Какая логика может быть, если мы пришли к необходимости эту триаду наполовину срезать и уничтожить?
I said to the President, is it logical if we both believe that we will be cutting by 1/2 the nuclear triad and we will be lowering the nuclear confrontation? Why start a new arms race in outer space where the consequences are unpredictable?
Gorbachev wanted to make everything conditional on our agreement to confine SDI research to, he called it the laboratory. So it was pretty evident that what that meant was basically to kill it.
Do you have an agreement, Mr. President?
Reagan, who liked to say that if he could negotiate with Hollywood studio chiefs, he could negotiate with anyone, got up and ended the meeting.
I was watching on television when they came out of that little house and I saw Ronnie's face. I knew everything was not fine.
Билли, он сказал, что с обидой сказал.
And when we were outside standing near those limos, he said with a feeling of resentment, he was upset, he said, well, you're responsible for this kind of ending. And I said, Mr. President, I disagree. If you don't insist on SDI, we could go back and sign all our agreements. The SDI was his favorite baby.
То ли связано с технологией, то ли с тем, чтобы...
Gorbachev said, I don't know what I could have done. And Reagan said, you could have said yes. And he just went right in his face. And then we got back to the embassy, and I had this speech that I was going to have to rewrite. And Reagan came out of a room, and he was cussing. He was cursing. He was cursing angry.
They really went nose to nose. I think Gorbachev found out at that time that he couldn't push Ronnie, he couldn't bluff Ronnie.
For a time, Reykjavik looked like a dramatic failure, but negotiations soon resumed, even as Reagan stood by SDI. And 8 months later, he issued a dramatic challenge at one of the Cold War's defining landmarks, the Brandenburg Gate in divided Berlin.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Москве. Меня это удивило. Это эксцентрическая такая выходка. Я думаю, что оно даже удивило.
I was in Moscow and I was surprised. I felt that this was a rather eccentric thing to say. He was a person who made decisions, who signed agreements, but at the same time he was into acting and directing. He had a PR side to him, which was always present.
Я ведь в то время, когда начал работать генсеком.
Some U.S. officials winced at the president's rhetoric.
I think in retrospect, it was a very, very strong statement that offered hope. I think there's one place where he got a lot of criticism for something that later on people would say, hey, this was a defining moment.
I believe a president must speak with moral clarity. And one of the things I remember clearly about President Reagan is he didn't say, well, Mr. Gorbachev, would you take the top 3 bricks off the wall? He said, tear it all down.
Ultimately, Reagan and Gorbachev signed a treaty eliminating an entire class of nuclear missiles.
The maxim is, doviai no proviai. Trust but verify.
Назначение этого...
На каждой встрече вы это повторяете.
You repeat that at every meeting.
Just before he left office, Ronald Reagan visited Gorbachev in Moscow. The wall itself would come down a year later. But it was already clear how far the president and the world had traveled. He was asked if he still considered the Soviet Union to be an evil empire.
Сделал президент Горбачев, и тот путь, который они избрали.
He said, I think that what President Gorbachev has done and the path they have chosen enables me to say that this is a different country today. And what I said at that time, I never rejected. But as his partner, I can tell you, he was a big person.
В своем возрасте, приверженный консервативным ценностям, он, тем не менее, менялся.
A major individual, and even though committed to very conservative values. If at that time someone else had been in his place, I don't know whether what happened would have happened.
Потому что я думал так, американцы...
As his presidency came to a close, Ronald Reagan was nearly 78. He was the first president since Dwight Eisenhower to complete 2 full terms. So now, with the actor's sense of the moment, it was time for the curtain call, the first of several difficult but graceful exits.
My fellow Americans, this is the 34th time I'll speak to you from the Oval Office, and the last. We've been together 8 years now, and soon it'll be time for me to go.
It was very painful. You know, they had a going away party for us at the White House, which we didn't know about.
You have our respect and our thanks, but you also have our affection as well as our love.
We've gone through a lot together, all those people. The shooting, my father's death, the cancer operations, Ronnie's 2 cancer operations, my cancer operation, my mother's death. I mean, you know, we went through it together.
It's been quite a journey this decade, and we held together through some stormy seas.
He spoke of 2 great triumphs.
One is the economic recovery, in which the people of America created and filled 19 million new jobs. The other is the recovery of our morale.
The man who seldom showed his emotion, who was always a bit of a mystery, whose own children couldn't get past that last elusive 10%, would open the window just a bit. One of the things about the presidency, he acknowledged, is that you're always somewhat apart.
I went in the Oval Office about 10, I guess, when I knew the president was supposed to come by. And at some point, he said, the only regret I have was sending those Marines into Lebanon. And then he walked to the door and opened it with one hand and reached up and gave his 2-finger salute to the office, turned around and walked out.
He didn't go out whining about the loneliest job in the world. Nobody understands me. This is a terrible burden, and you know, posing dramatically, looking out of the Oval Office so they get the lighting right on the burdened face. I mean, he didn't whine about it. He didn't complain about that.
As the helicopter lifted off from the Capitol grounds to do the ceremonial trip around Washington, as we passed over the White House, President Reagan looked out the window, tapped Nancy on her knee.
And Ronnie leaned over to me and said, "Look, honey, there's our little shack."
It was back to California, posh Bel Air, the treasured ranch.
Was that a tough transition?
No, and every transition was easy for Ronnie. Everyone. It was never difficult for Ronnie. Ever.
And through it all, his family says the essential Reagan never really changed.
I never heard him brag his entire life. I never saw him condescend to anybody. I never saw him treat one person different than he treated anybody else.
But within a few years, family and friends started to notice that something was wrong.
It was in the early 90s when I went out to Los Angeles and met with him and had some friends from the Hollywood industry in to see him, and one of them said to him, "How have you stayed to be so optimistic all your life?" And I said, "Oh, well, tell him a story about the optimist and the pessimist," which is a joke he'd told 10,000 times. And he looked at me with a blank stare. And I said, "You know, one about the 2 boys, one of them's an optimist and one's a pessimist." Well, I had to go through the whole story. And Reagan slapped his knee and laughed. When we finished the meeting, I walked into the chief of staff's office and I said, "What is wrong with him?" He said, "What are you talking about?" And I told him the story. And he said, "Well, we don't know, but he's going to the Mayo Clinic to get checked out." And that was the beginning of it. I had never seen it before.
Thank you. Thank all of you very much.
His 83rd birthday would be his last shared with the public.
Frankly, for a minute there, I was a bit concerned that after all these years away from Washington, you all wouldn't recognize me.
The instincts and the humor were competing with time.
Pretty soon I'm going to have to get one of those credit cards with my picture on the front.
Ronald Reagan had handwritten literally thousands of letters, but none remotely like the one dated November 5th, 1994. My fellow Americans, he wrote, I have recently been told that I am one of the millions of Americans who will be afflicted with Alzheimer's disease.
The letter, which I thought was remarkable, and he sat in the library and just sat and wrote it. But we did talk first.
I only wish there was some way I could spare Nancy from this painful experience.
We had always gone public with whatever had happened to us. And this letter, I think, really was very helpful to people. I think it opened the door, really, for a knowledge about Alzheimer's that people didn't have.
5 days later, or 6 days later, I got a letter that said Ronald Reagan. And I thought maybe it's something from the library, and I opened it, and it was a handwritten letter from Ronnie telling me what I had meant to he and Nancy in his lifetime. And it took me, even though it was one page, and it took me a long time to read the letter.
But he did not talk much about himself or his condition.
The most he would say at the early stages, which I think are the cruelest stages of Alzheimer's, because you are aware that you're losing awareness. You know, he would lose a sentence or something like that and say, you know, I can't, I have this thing. He'd say, I have this thing where I can't remember, I can't finish this thought, this sentence.
And for the family, a degree of resolution and reconciliation.
When he couldn't speak my name, when he would see me, when he couldn't say my name, his arms would open up. And I became the face that hugged him hello and hugged him goodbye and said, I love you.
He maintained the normal routines of his life as long as he could.
He always made light of bad things that would happen to him, you know, and he was joking about his loss of memory. He said, Dennis, he said, you know, there is one good thing about this Alzheimer's. I said, what's that? You know, this is going to be sick, right? He said, every day I meet new people. You know, and then, oh, here we go, you know, but that was him, you know.
Now the ranch itself was receding. John Barletta rode horses with Ronald Reagan here for more than a dozen years.
We came back from riding, this is after the letter, and I went down and talked to Mrs. Reagan, and I said, Miss Reagan, he can't ride anymore. And she just looked at me, and I said, he's making too many mistakes up there that a rookie wouldn't make, and we all know he's a great rider. And she said, well, you're gonna have to tell him that. And I didn't want to do that. So she said, he'll take it better coming from you. So we had lunch, and I called, and he come down in his house. Sit down, John. And I said, Mr. President, and I leaned forward. I said, we had a lot of problems out there today. I said, it's getting very unsafe. I said, I don't think you should ride anymore. He stood up and put his hands on my shoulders, and he went, I know. So in his worst hour, riding was his life. Then I had to tell him he couldn't do it anymore. He made me feel better. I know, it's okay. And that was it.
He didn't ride again?
Didn't ride again.
My very last meeting with him was in that same office when I walked in and sat down, and he didn't look up. And he had his fingers, and he was reading across a page large print, with a picture of a horse. And I said, "What are you reading?" And he very slowly looked up at me and said, "A horse."
Ronald Reagan's long ride took him from Dixon, Illinois to Washington, D.C., where he led a political revolution that bore his name. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary American journey.